Tonight from historic West Point, the Columbia Network starts a series of 6 broadcasts designed to help the War Department's campaign to make our soldiers not only the best equipped, but best informed fighting men in the entire world. In every camp in the United States and in every outpost throughout the world, soldiers of our Army are listening to this broadcast. Each Thursday night at this time, CBS will visit an Army outpost to broadcast a talk by experts on causes, issues, and strategy of war. Edward R. Murrow is tonight's speaker, and the remaining participants in the 6-week series will be Lee White, William L. Shirer, Herbert Agar, Quentin Reynolds, and Sergeant York. Now Major General F.B. Wilby is about to introduce tonight's speaker to the 1,500 enlisted men, cadets, and officers gathered in the War Department Theater. General Wilby.
Ladies and gentlemen, officers and ladies of the post, enlisted men stationed here at West Point, we are happy to have with us at West Point tonight one of the great correspondents of the Second World War, Mr. Edward R. Murrow, Chief of the European News Staff of the Columbia Broadcasting System. Mr. Murrow, amid the hail of Nazi bombs on the British capital, gave us a vivid picture of that great wounded city weathering a new kind of war. Tonight, Mr. Murrow makes what may be his last public appearance in this country before returning to London. He speaks to you at West Point and by radio to American soldiers in all posts in this country and overseas. His subject, the road to war. Mr. Murrow.
General Wilby, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this is rather frightening. Twice in the last 10 minutes, someone has come out here and urged you to react in some way, to laugh or applaud, and you have almost been invited to sleep. If you do, it will be no new experience. Because during the nights of heavy raids in London, we worked from an underground studio, and it was not at all uncommon for our friends to come down and sleep quite comfortably while we did a broadcast to the United States. Well, gentlemen, we have 12 and a half minutes in which to traverse the highway to war. And since the beginnings of that highway go back some 25 years, we shall have to proceed at a rate of something like 2 years per minute. We might begin this sorry tale with the League of Nations, or with Manchuria, or with Abyssinia, or the Rhineland, non-intervention in Spain, or the rape of Austria. Perhaps it would be better to start with the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, or even the German-Russian Pact. But it would be, I think, a mistake to place undue emphasis upon any single incident. There are certain landmarks that keep appearing and reappearing on this highway to war. If we look back at each crisis, each period of tension, we observe familiar terrain. This long and miserable road is littered with broken promises, irresolute policies, and the ghosts of timid statesmen who failed to recognize their enemies and who underestimated the strength of their opponents. Manchuria fell to the Japanese because there was no unity between London and Washington. The Italians overran Abyssinia because the democracies sought refuge in words and sanctions they failed to apply. Austria died without battle because she had committed the crime of being small. Czechoslovakia went down betrayed by her friends. Men and women in the so-called democracies said the Germans were fanatics, and they failed to remember the strength of fanaticism. In France, in Britain, and in the United States, people laughed at the policy of guns instead of butter. We failed to understand that the Germans would use those guns to go and get the butter, our butter. Each time Hitler mouthed his last territorial demand, some people believed him, failing to realize that there is no truce and there can be no compromise with the totalitarian mind. All along this highway to war, we may see the faces of men and women who didn't want to be disturbed, who feared to make sacrifices and grave decisions. We were in a valley with few heroic men and few heroic measures. Men began to say, is there any conviction worth fighting for? We became experts at delay and evasion and self-delusion. We were turning out of our institutions of higher learning, though certainly not out of this institution, men and women with a sense of privilege rather than a sense of responsibility. The objective was to gain a higher standard of living at the cost of the society that had made possible the superior intellectual training. So far as the rest of the world was concerned, we were putting on a cheap veneer of easy cynicism. We were sitting back behind our oceans with a holier-than-thou expression, saying, look at those miserable Europeans. What a mess they're making of things again. None of us can avoid some share of the blame for that sleep stumbling through a world where bestial brigands were seizing power and plotting our downfall. Their plans were poured into a mold labeled, when war comes. Our plans were made on the basis of if war comes. There was never a time when the forces of decency and democracy could not have cried halt. But we feared, and we failed to exercise our power, for we were men of little faith. Minds became dull and numbed as a result of repeated tales of horror and bloodletting. The democracies retreated from the world leadership, and they were devoured one by one. I wandered about Europe and watched it happen. Most of you will remember the tales about how the German tanks and armored cars broke down and littered the highways leading to Vienna. How the German High Command failed to reach its objective on schedule, even when they were occupying a country without resistance. Those stories were not true. Those of us who were there at the time knew they were false and said so. But the world preferred to believe the stories of obsolete equipment and inadequate planning. It was more comfortable so. Refusal to admit German planning and German power made it possible to postpone unpleasant decisions and sacrifices. Those who told of the suicides and the beatings in Vienna on those days and nights were labeled warmongers. And after all, people said, weren't the Austrians Germans? And perhaps they wanted the Germans to come in. We failed to understand the scope of the plan and the ruthlessness of the men who were executing it. When Czechoslovakia was tramped in the gutter, most of us preferred to pass by on the other side of the road. Let no one say that Mr. Chamberlain failed in those days to act in accordance with the wishes of the majority. The British didn't want war, and he avoided it. When that announcement came out of Munich, there was a sigh of relief throughout the island. There were many expressions of regret at the price that would be paid by Czechoslovakia. But many of us failed to realize that Britain and France and Poland and the Low Countries and the United States would pay part of that price, too. Payment was merely postponed, for there was no truce, and there can be no compromise. In the years that followed Munich, the people of Britain came to realize that. And when on that sunny Sunday morning, Mr. Chamberlain, employing an understatement, said, "It is evil things we will be fighting against," there was almost a sigh of relief went through that island from Land's End to John O'Groats. The recurring crises and periods of tension had passed, and the issue had been joined, and there would be no more retreating. At least, that's what we thought. But the war didn't come at once. The German armies crunched through Poland, while friends of mine sat at that shortwave transmitter on a little wooded knoll outside Warsaw and asked for the help that never came. After the Germans had overrun the rich black earth of Poland, there was a lull. Nothing happened. Some called it a phony war, others a sitzkrieg. In Britain, there was darkness, but the war seemed almost remote. In the early spring, the Germans struck at Norway. The British hastily assembled an expeditionary force, but Norway was lost. I talked with many of those men who came back from Norway. Their story was the same. as that of the men who later came back from Dunkirk, from Greece, and from Crete. They said, where were our aircraft? Why did our anti-aircraft guns arrive without predictors? Why was it on May 10th, when the German armies came scything up through Belgium, there was not a single round of armor-piercing ammunition available to the British forces on the continent? It was because the planning had been inadequate and the estimate of the enemy had been incorrect. After France fell, there came the Battle of Britain. And day after day, the German planes came over the island. They came at night as well. I remember one morning talking with a sergeant from an anti-aircraft battery in Hyde Park. And the guns had been hot all night, and the streets had been full of the raving roar of guns. And I asked him if he'd hit anything. And he said, spent all night shooting at nothing and hitting it every time. Even on the darkest days, the British retained their sense of humor, and they fought this war in a fashion that was grim and gay. One night they knocked the glass out of about 3 blocks, an area of 3 blocks. And the next morning a little cockney with a scarf and a greasy cap was sweeping up the broken glass with a big push broom. A crowd gathered to watch him. He suddenly stopped and twirled that big broom in the air and said, "Hitler's blinking housemaid." That's me. That was on a morning when many men, save Englishmen, despaired of England's life. We, on the other hand, sent them lease-lend material. But it was a bitter thing to go down to a city on the morning after a raid, read a little box in the local paper reporting that another 10 or 20,000 American workmen had gone out on strike. We were retreating from our responsibilities. We would all have understood our responsibilities. We'd had an opportunity to talk with the men who came to that island from Norway, from Holland, from France, men who literally sought liberty or death. Well, the first question they asked, and they were asking it before we entered this war, was what of the United States? Because they knew that we were their sole source of promise and of hope, and that the decisions would be ours. It is clear, I think, that we have traveled a highway from neutrality and indifference through cash and carry, lease-lend, to Pearl Harbor. As a nation, we have argued and debated each step of the way. That's our tradition. Great nations do not go to war lightly, for wars are much easier to start than to stop, as our enemies will discover. The road to peace is obscured by the smoke of battle. Certainly it will be no easy road to travel. Men and nations may fall by the wayside. But in the end of the day, at the end of the road, we shall break the hearts of those people who plan to enslave us. This is a test of wills. Our enemies have won great victories, and these victories have been due not alone to a superiority in tanks, aircraft, and equipment. They have been stronger in arms because they were stronger in heart. Our faith must be greater than their faith. We shall reach the end of this highway not only as a result of superior firepower, but as a result of greater appetite.
That was Edward R. Murrow speaking to officers, cadets, and soldiers at West Point on the road to war. First in a series of 6 from Army camps on What Are We Fighting For? American soldiers in every corner of the globe are listening to this broadcast. Next Thursday at this same time, 6:15 p.m. Eastern Wartime, Lee White will be heard from Fort George, Meade, Maryland on the war to date. John Tillman speaking. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Our Army is not only to be the best equipped and the best trained, but it is also to be the best informed Army in the world. Our soldiers are to know what we are fighting for. To help them understand, outstanding Americans are appearing before the troops at Army posts throughout the nation, discussing the causes, issues, and strategy of the war. Each Thursday night at this time, for the next 6 weeks, the Columbia Network will visit an Army post to broadcast a portion of such a speech to American troops. You will hear in their appearances before troops William L. Shirer, Quentin Reynolds, Herbert Agar, and Sergeant Alvin C. Tonight we are at Camp George Meade in Maryland, with officers and soldiers now waiting. Colonel Oliver S. Wood, the commanding officer at Fort Meade, will introduce the speaker. Colonel Wood.
Officers and men at Fort Meade, and those listening by radio and Army posts in the United States and overseas. Tonight you are to hear a noted correspondent of the war. Many of you doubtless remember the broadcast of Lee White during the Balkan crisis and campaign. Those were tense, exciting, disastrous days. This correspondent was a victim of Nazi guns in the Yugoslavian campaign. He was among those evacuated at Crete and reached this country from Africa. Tonight, this wounded correspondent, returned from the wars in Europe and the Mediterranean, is practically recovered. We are happy to hear him speak tonight on the war to date. Mr. Lee White.
It's strange that I should have been, of all correspondents, the one selected to talk to you about the war from Pearl Harbor to the present. For I was in Europe for 5 years and only managed to return to the United States on October 11th, 7 weeks before that fateful date. Since then, I have spent most of my time in the hospital, recovering from a wound I received in Greece a year ago. Until recently, I was shut off entirely from the outside world. Now I am addressing you here at Fort Meade, the first group of American soldiers I've set my eyes on since I returned to this country. I can't tell you much about America's war effort since Pearl Harbor, that is, the American phase of it. But I can tell you what our entry into the war since Pearl Harbor has meant to the majority of Europeans. As we all know, this war did not begin on December 7th, not even for Americans. This war began 10 years ago, in January 1932, when Japan invaded China. 3 years later, in December 1934, Italy invaded Abyssinia. And the unwillingness of the great powers to apply sanctions destroyed the League of Nations. And whether we as Americans liked it or not, the League was the nearest approach the world has ever made to some international system of law and order. Without the authority of the League of Nations, law and order was gone, and Europe's decline toward anarchy began. The war for each one of us began at a different time, the moment when we personally became involved. For me, the war began in Spain. In July 1936, General Franco led his revolution against the government of the Spanish Republic. When it appeared that Franco could not win the war alone, Hitler and Mussolini helped him. Before the war was over in March 1939, most of the world had begun to realize that it was no civil war, no fight between nationalists and Reds, as many people tried to make us believe, but a Nazi, fascist invasion of a country whose government was very much like ours. China was 6,000 miles away. So was Abyssinia. Spain was much closer to home. Before the war in Spain was over, Hitler had taken Austria. Then he invaded Czechoslovakia, then Poland. And with the chronology of the war since then, we are all bitterly familiar. Every country which has been at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan, from China through Abyssinia and Spain, up to and including the United States, has been fighting for the same thing: freedom, national freedom. I will not attempt to call freedom democracy, for they are not the same. Freedom breeds democracy. Democracy cannot exist without it. All of our allies in the present struggle are fighting for freedom of one sort or another. Some of them may not have been lucky enough to enjoy the sort of democracy we have here in America. Some of them may not have even been able to enjoy freedom. And without freedom, there is nothing. National freedom, liberty, independence must come first. Then all the other freedoms follow, one after the other, until democracy is finally achieved. So we are not fighting a war for democracy only. We are fighting a war for freedom, all sorts of freedom, and freedom is something more fundamental, more diverse. President Roosevelt, in a press conference last week, called for a new name for the Second World War. I suggest we call it the War for Freedom. That's what everybody's fighting for. Why try to complicate the issue by calling it something else? Why try to specify what we are fighting against? No war has ever been won against anything. All wars have been won for something. This war will be won for freedom. And December 7th, when America entered the war, was the first time it was possible for the rest of the world, and especially Europe, even to conceive that freedom was in sight. Without America, everything would have been lost, including America. With America, everything is possible. We haven't done much yet. We haven't had time. The American people, the American nation, is a gigantic organism. We're like the dinosaur. Somebody once investigated the nervous structure of the dinosaur and found that that animal was so sluggish that if he were hit over the head, it would take him several hours, or maybe it was days or weeks or months to wake up to the fact that he had been hit. I think most of us here tonight know how hard hit we were at Pearl Harbor. But a lot of us, especially the civilians, are only just beginning to realize it. They will wake up. Before this war is over, everybody will be so waked up he will never be able to sleep again. And that is going to be a good thing. For until America gets excited about the future of the world has no future. The future is ours. Pearl Harbor and what has happened since, for me, has been the beginning of the end of the war. The war that began in China 10 years ago. This is a European point of view. But I have been living in Europe almost continuously for 5 years, and I have come to appreciate America as only Europeans can. I doubt if many Americans think of America in just that way. We're all so used to America here that we lose sight of what we mean to the rest of the world. The great influence that we have in countries some of us have never even heard of. The great hope we represent to the peoples of every other nation. As I say, this war began for me when I first arrived in Spain, and I have been living and breathing this war personally and professionally ever since. It's funny when I think of it. I was a pacifist back in 1937, yet I went to the war in Spain, and I've never been quite the same since. I learned there a lot of things from those soldiers who fought for 33 long months, without airplanes, without artillery, without uniforms, most of them, against all the modern electrically fired batteries and bombers and machine guns of the Germans and the Italians. I was working for the Daily Express of London at that time. I used to visit the front-line trenches almost every day when a battle was going on, and every time I did, those ragged troops used to ask me, when is England going to help us? I knew, of course, that nobody was going to help them then. Sometimes I used to avoid the issue by saying, I'm not an Englishman, I'm just an American working for an English paper. Then those Spaniards would say, but when is America going to help us? America's a great democracy, too. Doesn't America realize we're fighting the war for America because we want to be like America? There used to be a lot of talk about the part the Russians played in Spain. Russia was an ally of the Republic, just as Germany and Italy were the allies of the Spanish fascists. That made the Spanish Republicans Reds, though for some reason it never made the Spanish fascists fascists. By the same token, we Americans would be Reds today, merely because Russia is our ally. The Spanish Republicans were not Russians. They were merely Spaniards fighting for their national freedom. They admired Russia for helping them, just as we admire Russia for the fight she is putting up against our common enemies today. But those Spaniards admired America more than they ever admired Russia, and they admired us even when we did not help them, and that's a greater tribute. All of my Spanish friends, no matter what they called themselves politically, were so full of admiration for America that I began to admire us too. I never really appreciated America until I went to Spain. I never realized what the word America meant to most Europeans. Since then, I have lived in France, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Greece. And everywhere it was the same. America. Not Russia, not Germany, not any other country. America was the hope of the world. I remember a certain day in Budapest, Hungary, a country which is now one of our enemies. The day was November 4th, 1940. Mr. Roosevelt had just been reelected President of the United States. The people in Budapest were probably more excited about the outcome of the election than most of us back home. It was embarrassing for me. Everywhere I went, in the cafes where I was known, not by name, of course, merely as an American correspondent, the people literally cheered and applauded me because I was an American. Some of them even had the daring to call out, "Long live America, long live Roosevelt." What I'm not trying to emphasize is not that Mr. Roosevelt defeated Mr. Wilkie. That's not important, and anyway, I admire Mr. Wilkie just as much as the President does himself. What I'm trying to emphasize is that in Nazi-dominated Budapest, despite the censored press that painted Mr. Roosevelt as an ogre, despite the spies of the Gestapo and the police, the people dared to cheer America because they felt that only America could save them. I shall never forget another day in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. a country which is one of our loyalist allies in this war. That day was March 27th, 1941. The fascist government of Premier Cvetkovic, the man who would have sold Yugoslavia to Hitler, had just been overthrown. General Simovic, the present prime minister, had just led a successful coup d'etat and installed King Peter on the throne. The people were overcome with joy. For weeks they had been wearing the Union Jack and the stars and stripes in their lapels and playing Tipperary against the laws of their government and in the faces of the German tourists. There was a patriotic demonstration that day, but beside the Yugoslav flag, those patriots voluntarily and without asking anyone's permission raised the English flag on one side and the American flag on the other. This later proved somewhat embarrassing to the State Department, but the important fact is this. The Yugoslavs, as they consciously and willingly committed national suicide, went down waving the American flag with their own. In Greece, I was wounded by a Nazi bomber. For 4.5 months, I was cared for in a hospital in Athens. The Greek doctors and nurses treated me better than they treated any of the wounded Greeks, merely because I was an American. Some days, I only had a single potato to eat. The people were starving. But if I had one potato to eat, that was 1/2 of a potato more than the others had. Before I left Athens, the Greek doctor who had been treating me said, "Don't forget to tell them back in America about us. We're still your allies, and we need your help." That was last September. My Greek doctor was referring to us as his allies, and we had not even entered the war. There you have America's responsibility. Unconsciously or not, we have been an example and a hope for the rest of the world. That is what Pearl Harbor means to me. That is what Pearl Harbor means to all Americans, all who have been in Europe, and to all Europeans. Pearl Harbor means that America has entered the war and will win the war, and that America will mold the future of the world. We have sustained several great defeats since then, defeats such as we had never sustained before. But they will be amply repaid as soon as our army and our war production grows. But meanwhile, these defeats should give us calm. Isolationists, though many of us were, we were also cocky. The mistakes the English made and the defeats they sustained could never happen to us, we thought. Now we know that they can. Now we know that anything can happen. The Germans and the Japanese have broken every established military cannon. They smashed through the impregnable Maginot Line. They broke through the impassable mountains of Greece and Yugoslavia. And they invaded Crete without a navy because they had an air force. So the Japs have broken all the rules. They have extended their lines of communication without regard for safety. They have shown us that anything and everything is possible, and that should give us confidence. For we have everything the Japanese and the Germans have, and more. We have ourselves in the first place, and secondly, we have all the rest of the world on our side, waiting for the day when they can welcome our troops, waiting for the day when, with our help, they can at last do what they've always wanted to do, make their own American revolutions.
From Fort George and Meade, Maryland, the War Department and the Columbia Network have broadcast another talk to American soldiers everywhere, designed to tell them why and who we are fighting. Lee White, Columbia's correspondent injured in Greece, was today's speaker. Next week, William L. Shirer will be heard from Fort Belvoir. He will speak on the subject, Your Enemies, the Fascists. Gunner Back speaking. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Well, that'll just about wrap things up for today. Certainly hope you enjoyed the programs. If you'd like to contact us for more information on how to purchase the programs, give us a request for upcoming programs, or just any kind of comments you'd like whatsoever, you may do so by going to our website at otrsite.com, or you may email us at jerry@otrsite.com, or you may call area code 562-696-4387. We'd certainly love to hear from you. And this is Jerry Hendigas saying thanks a lot for listening. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you right here next week, same time, same station. Bye now.
Men of the armed forces, I've been asked to say a few words about our fascist enemies. The enemies we've got to smash if our world, our land of America, our kind of free and decent life is to survive. I don't say our kind of life in this country is perfect. There are things I don't like and things you don't like. A lot of things could be improved. But as one who has spent the last 8 years mostly in the totalitarian lands, I can tell you that what we have is infinitely better than what they have, or what we'll have if they win this war. The difference is this: they're slaves and we're free, but we won't be free unless we win. You hear a lot of talk that we're fighting to make this world a better place to live in, and of course we are. With Hitler and Hirohito and the little Ducha out of the way, their murdering and plundering stopped, it follows naturally that it will be a better world. It will be a world with a little decency and human dignity restored to it, and that's very important. I've seen what happens to nations and peoples that Hitler conquers. I've seen how he destroys them with a brutality, with a ruthlessness that you have to see to really comprehend. It seems to me, therefore, that to begin with, we're fighting to avoid that fate for ourselves, to avoid being destroyed and being enslaved. We're fighting to survive and to remain free. If that sounds to some of you a little academic, I would remind you of what happened, say, to the Poles and the French. I saw them destroyed and enslaved, and I'd rather be dead, and I think you would too, than to have that happen here. For some 3,000 years now, the military leaders have always emphasized that it's absolutely essential, if you're going to win a war, and you and I know we're going to win this one, that it's essential to know your enemies so that you're able to size them up, estimate their strength and weaknesses. In my small way, I'd like to try to do that today. In the past, we have often been guilty of underestimating our enemies. You remember those stories so current 6 months ago about those obsolete Jap planes and those miserable little pygmy Jap pilots. Like most Americans, I believed them then. One personal word here, if I may. I want to assure you that I am not one of those armchair civilians who has come to incite you men in uniform with a lot of fake atrocity stories about the enemy. The truth about him needs no adornment. In my job, I got to know something about our chief enemies, the Nazis. Those very able thugs, some of you, no doubt, are going to get acquainted with before this war is over. About the main enemy, the other main enemy, rather, the Japs, I have no first-hand knowledge. I know only what you know, that they're treacherous and cruel. If you remember the authentic accounts of the horrors they perpetrated in Nanking, when they captured that great Chinese city, you could not have been surprised at the story the other day of how they had bound 50 British prisoners in Hong Kong to stakes and then bayoneted them to death. It was not new. The Japs have been doing that in China for years. That's the kind of soldiers they are. The Italians are also among our fascist enemies, but the chances are you will not meet many of them in this war. Being, in my estimation, a rather decent people, their hearts are not in the war. They're mere prisoners of the Nazis. You know the story of the Italian and Frenchman who met on the border the other day. The Italian said, "How lucky you French are." "What do you mean lucky?" asked the Frenchman. "Why, in France," said the Italian, "you at least have an unoccupied zone." That leaves us our Germans to deal with, our Nazi enemies. And they're the boys who are out to conquer the world, including our world. Two things might be said about the Nazi Germans at the outset. First, they are out not only to conquer our world, but to smash it. Second, in attaining that goal, they will stop at nothing. Let me explain what I mean. Take the first point, the Nazi goal. You all know what Hitler has said in his book, Mein Kampf. There he states his aim bluntly. It is to make the Germans supreme masters of the globe. That is the Nazi objective. But it goes further than that. Hitler says the enemy is to be annihilated, not only conquered, but wiped out. Now, in this country, there is a lot of silly talk that aims to distinguish the Nazis from the Germans, the party thugs from the German army, which we are told is made up of nice, clean gentlemen. One of the greatest of our American writers has recently written a very moving novel and made it into a very successful play. And in all sincerity, he makes out a group of German army officers in an occupied town as very decent chaps indeed, as gentlemen who hate the dirty job Hitler has given them. In my own experience with the German army in Poland, Holland, Belgium, and France, I personally saw only 2 German army officers who hated the dirty job Hitler had given them. The rest were enthusiastic about that job, and they killed very cold-bloodedly for Führer and Vaterland, as they put it. After all, it was not only the Nazi toughs who admitted what they were trying to do. 3 years before this war broke out, the German army itself defined very precisely its aims in total war. They were published in the German military publication Deutsche Wehr. Let me quote. "Total war," said the German army, "means the complete and final disappearance of the vanquished from the stage of history." That, from the German military men who squeal like stuck pigs at the pinpricks we administered Germany after she was beaten in the last war. When we won, we didn't try to erase Germany from the stage of history. Instead, we, especially the Americans, tried to help her up on her feet. But if Germany wins this time, let's have no illusions. With a nice gentleman of the German army doing the dirty work, she will try to liquidate us completely. War, of course, is no sissy's game. But the Germans are always complaining that their enemies don't fight fair and clean. Well, let's see how the Germans fight. The slaughter of civilians, especially of women and children, has been frightful in this war, far worse than in any previous war in history. But it was no secret in Berlin that the mass killing of civilians was done very deliberately by the German High Command. It was part of the new total war, part of Hitler's calculated strategy of terror. Consider Warsaw. It was completely surrounded by the German army 2 weeks after the Polish campaign started. The fighting elsewhere was over. The city could not possibly hold out more than a few weeks. But Hitler wanted to give the Poles and the world a lesson. He knew there were more than 500,000 women and children in the city. And so he turned not only his bombers on Warsaw, but had his heavy artillery fire point blank into the city. The slaughter of women and children was indescribable. Was that an isolated instance? Well, consider what happened 8 months later. Hitler had invaded the West. The Dutch, instead of surrendering, as the Germans had asked them to do, were fighting. The German High Command decided to give them a lesson. It gave the order to wipe out the central part of the city of Rotterdam by a dive-bombing attack. Now, this attack was not carried out against Dutch troops. Only a few of them were in the city. It was a deliberate decision on the part of the German military command to slaughter not opposing troops, but helpless civilians. The Germans figured it would be so frightful it would induce the Dutch to surrender, and this strategy of terror succeeded. The butchery in Rotterdam will be remembered for 1,000 years. In that spring that Hitler threw his armies into the West, a bunch of American correspondents arrived in Calais or Dunkirk, I forget which. The town was in flames. But that wasn't what struck the newspaper men. What struck them was that on the quay, a long line of Red Cross ambulances had been smashed to smithereens by a German dive bomb attack. The wounded killed in their stretchers before they could be placed on ships. Goering's bombers had done it deliberately, for the pilots could easily see the Red Cross signs painted on the top of the ambulances. Later on, as we went into Paris with the German army, we found one of the reasons why the Germans refused to respect the Red Cross sign. They were abusing it themselves, and supposed that the French and the British were too. In a big German gasoline dump north of Paris, I saw myself scores of German tank trucks disguised as Red Cross ambulances. To avoid being bombed, these trucks carrying gasoline for Nazi planes had big Red Cross signs painted all over them. That was one of the ways that the German army fought. Well, for a while, it was an invincible army. Nothing stopped it. The French, for example, seemed paralyzed by the very sight of it. But our Russian friends have shown us that German army is not so invincible. That good as it is, it can be stopped and beaten back. How did the Russians stop it? By doing three things, I think. First, by fighting. And the Soviet army was the first well-equipped army on our side which did stand up and fight in this war. Second, the Russians found the answer to the mechanized panzer attack. They learned how to defend in depth. They crushed German infantry and artillery, which came in behind the tanks. Third, the Russians found out what everyone knew all the time, or should have known, that much-advertised Stuka dive bomber is not much good when you put some fighter planes against it. Well, what the Russian army has done, we can do too. The time is late. The Germans are still strong. Their air force is immense, so is their tank corps. They still have a lot of fight and cunning left in them, and cruelty, and they grow desperate. Their increasing plundering and murdering in the occupied lands shows us that. But they can be beaten, and it will be our job to help finish them off. I thank you.
What are we fighting for? To make our soldiers the best informed in the world, the War Department, for the past several months, has been presenting discussions before the troops of all our Army posts of the nation's best-known commentators. In them, the causes, issues, and strategies of the war are brought before the men of our Army. Each Thursday at this time, the Columbia Network visits one of these Army posts to pick up one of these talks and to broadcast it to other Army posts, both in this country and overseas. Tonight, we are at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, before 1,000 officers and men. To introduce tonight's speaker, we now present the post commander, Brigadier General George L. Van Dusen.
Officers and men of Fort Monmouth, and those listening by radio at other Army stations in the United States and overseas, today we are to hear an internationally famous writer and foreign correspondent who has spent much of his time in the countries of which he is about to speak, the countries of our allies. As special writer for Collier's magazine, his articles in the last 2 years have revealed not only the strategy of war in Britain, Russia, and Africa, but also the manner in which our allies have dared death that freedom might live. So it is most fitting that he should speak to us of our lives, your comrades in arms. It is my pleasure to welcome to Fort Monmouth Mr. Quentin Reynolds.
Thank you, sir. I've spent most of the past 2 years in England, in Russia, in Libya, and I'm returning to the war zone within a week or so. During the past 2 months, I've been bouncing around this country, spending a lot of time in factories which make war material, spending a lot of time with the men in charge of civilian defense. During that time, I've been asked a lot of questions about your comrades in arms. What kind of fighters are they? Can they take it? Can they give it? I've been asked a lot of questions about the Russian army and about the Russian people. Maybe you fellows have some of the same questions in mind. During the past few years, the Nazi propaganda in our country has been very effective. Congressmen, senators running for office who had no other issue on which to stand would dig deeply into the political grab bag and come up with that old political chestnut, beware of the Red Menace. Consciously or unconsciously, they worked hand in hand with the Nazi propagandists. And we, like dumb sheep, believed half the lies we heard about Russia. I was there last fall. It took me about a week to find out that the Russians are our kind of people. It took me about a month to realize that they had absolutely no interest in overthrowing our kind of government and that they had no sympathy with American communists who were of that mind. In fact, I found out that the Russians were greatly embarrassed by American communists who gave them such a bad name. All the Russians wanted was to be left alone. That's all they want now. When the war is over, they'll keep on with their form of government, communism, but they don't care whether any other country adopts it. People ask me, can we trust the Russians? I think close to 2 million of them who have fallen in battle have proven that the Russians can be trusted until the death. I sometimes wonder when people ask me that, whether or not the Russians can trust us. I met a Russian captain who was on leave from the front while I was in Moscow. He talked English and we became very friendly. One night I was sitting with him and with an English correspondent. We had a few drinks of vodka, and as happens when you have a few drinks of vodka, you get to doing a lot of talking. We started making plans for after the war. What kind of a world would it be after we've licked the Germans and the Japs? The British correspondent and I had all sorts of plans. The Germans would have to be kept in check so we wouldn't have to go through all this mess again. But how to keep them in check? That was the question. Oh, we had plenty of ideas, none of them very good. Then our Russian captain said quietly, we in the Red Army have a plan. After we have chased the Germans out of our country, we'll keep right on and chase them back to Berlin. Then you British keep out of it for a month or so. You Americans keep out of it, too, for a little while. Just let us be the army of occupation for a month, and things will adjust themselves. Yes, we can trust the Russians all right. The Russians are filled with hatred for the Nazi army, which completely devastated the Ukraine and southern and central Russia. Hatred is a good, healthy emotion. Countries which don't hate tyranny enough have proven easy victims for Hitler. Belgium, Holland, Norway, France, they didn't hate fascism enough. The Russians do, and they're proving it. Remember, the Russians aren't fighting for communism. The Russians are fighting for Russia. Believe me, they're our kind of people. And sooner or later, when you get to the front with them, fighting at your side, you'll realize it. In a fight, a Russian is a good man to have along. In my tour around this country, a lot of people asked me about the British. I was amazed to find that a lot of people thought that the British weren't doing much fighting on their own, that they were letting the Canadians and South Africans, New Zealanders and Australians do it for them. I think that this sort of talk sprang from that master propagandist of the radio, Lord Haw-Haw. He's been harping on it for months, and a lot of our countrymen have believed him. I've seen the British fight. I saw the British civilians fight back in London, in Plymouth, in Coventry, in Southampton. I saw bombs destroy their homes, kill their children, wound and maim half the population of cities. But I never heard one Britisher say, let's quit. I've been with the British Navy running the gauntlet of the English or British Channel, slipping through the submarine-infested waters of the North Atlantic. I've been out on their trawlers, mine-sweeping, and I've been with them in the desert. Only 3 months ago, I was with a British regiment, the 1st Royal Sussex. It was just an ordinary line regiment. It had orders to capture a place called Sidi Omar, south of Tobruk. Sidi Omar was nothing but a 1-mile raised plateau in the desert, heavily held by Germans and Italians. To make things tougher, the Germans had surrounded the plateau with a minefield. You know, there are always gaps in a minefield through which tanks and men can pass safely, if you can find the gaps. For these tough men of the 1st Royal Sussex, most of them farmers or the sons of farmers, were in too much of a hurry to to look for any gaps. They busted right through the barbed wire, they and their tanks. They rushed through the minefields, although 100 machine guns were trained on them, mowing them down. You know about those mines. They're buried maybe 10 inches below the sand, and the tread of a man's foot will explode them. These British soldiers I was with knew that, but they yelled to hell with the mines and broke through. It was pretty horrible. 10 tanks blew up, but the men rushing behind the tanks didn't stop. They wanted to get in close with that steel. Some of them did. Hundreds didn't. But those crazy men who were so filled with the healthy emotion of hatred toward our common enemy kept on. And once they were in close, it was a beautiful sight. It was a beautiful sight if you hate Germans as I hate Germans. It was a beautiful sight to one who had been on the defensive for 2 years, taking it all the time, to see these British soldiers giving it. They didn't show much mercy. When the smoke cleared and we were in complete possession of the plateau, the Germans made a counterattack, a nasty one. They came with 24 tanks and with their dive bombers. They gave us plenty of hell for a while, but those British soldiers are bulldogs. They held on. For 3 days and 3 nights they gave it to us, and then reinforcements came and we were all right. I told the colonel in command that I'd been on lots of fronts, but never in my life had I seen men fight like this. It was the greatest exhibition of courage I'd ever seen. The British colonel smiled and said quietly, I saw men fight like that once before. It was at Chateau Thierry, and the men were United States Marines. Yes, the British are fighting and dying, but the British War Office is much like our War Department. They don't believe much in patting themselves on the back. They don't believe in making public heroes out of men who have no desire to be anything but good soldiers. So the world hasn't learned much about the way the men of Britain fight and die. Only a handful of us correspondents have been privileged to see them in action. They die very well. You can't give higher praise than that to soldiers. The Germans know how to fight, and they know, too, how the British fight. I've talked to lots of German prisoners. They're good soldiers, mind you. After all, they've been trained since birth in this business of murder. They're professionals at it. Their pilots are good, too. But they fear one thing, the British Spitfire. The Spitfire won the Battle of Britain, just as our Curtiss Wright P-40s are winning the Battle of the East. The Germans fear the Spitfires just as the Japs fear our pursuit ships. I went to a hospital in Kent one day to talk to some German prisoners who were there. There were 12 German airmen who'd bailed out over England and who were in this ward. A doctor came in and was horrified and angry to find that 11 of these 12 German airmen were covered with black and blue marks. And he turned to the nurse and said angrily, "What's the meaning of this? Have you allowed someone in here to beat these men up?" She said, "Oh, no, doctor, it isn't that at all." He said, "Why are they covered with black and blue marks, then?" She said, "Well, doctor, last night, that 12th German airman was delirious all night. And in his delirium, he kept crying out, 'Spitfire, Spitfire.' And every time he cried out, 'Spitfire,' the other 11 bailed out of bed." Don't sell our allies short. They're fighting men just as you are fighting men. Don't believe the propaganda from the enemies outside our country and from the enemies within our borders. For 2 years, they've tried to tell us that this wasn't our war. For 2 years, they've tried to tell us of the great difference which existed between America and Britain and Russia. But we know better now. We know there's only one fundamental difference between America and Britain and Russia. It's this. Here in America, we drive our cars on the right side of the road. In England, they drive to the left. And anyone who's ever been in Moscow knows those crazy Russians drive right down the middle of the road. But the road to Berlin is a wide one. And there's room enough on it for all three of us. And America can take the right side of the road. And Britain can take the left of the road. And Russia can take the middle of the road. And we'll go swinging along, side by side. No matter how long the road is, or how many detours there may be through the Far East or other places, it won't bother us, because we know that as long as we three trust each other, that road will bring us to Berlin together.
From Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, the War Department and the Columbia Network have broadcast the fourth in a series of talks to American soldiers here and abroad as part of a comprehensive program by the Army designed to keep our soldiers the best informed in the world. The speaker tonight on this series, titled What Are We Fighting For?, was Quentin Reynolds, foreign correspondent and associate editor of Collier's Magazine. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. What are we fighting for? The best soldiers in the world are the ones who know what they're fighting for. And to make our soldiers the best informed in the world, the War Department has been presenting talks by well-known persons, experts in their various fields of knowledge, before our troops at Army posts throughout the nation. Each Thursday at this time, the Columbia Network picks up one of these talks at some Army post and broadcasts it to troops elsewhere in America and also by short wave to our men overseas. Tonight, we're with the officers and men of Mitchell Field, Long Island. To introduce our speaker of the evening, we present the commanding officer of the post, Colonel Douglas Johnston. Colonel Johnston.
Officers and men of Mitchell Field, and to those listening by radio and other Army stations in the United States and overseas, tonight we ought to hear an outstanding citizen of these United States, a man who has long stood forth for the prosecution of the war for freedom. He is well known as the publisher of the Louisville Courier-Journal, conductor of the column, What Are We Fighting For? And as president of New York's Freedom House, his topic tonight is indeed fitting. What we fight for, Mr. Herbert Agar.
Gentlemen, I think that if we teach ourselves exactly why this war had to happen, we will learn at the same time exactly what we are fighting for. We are not in this war merely because we were attacked at Pearl Harbor or because Germany declared war on us a few days later. Pearl Harbor was the last of a series of events, all of which had to happen, and all of which proved to us that war was being waged against us as well as against the rest of the decent people in the world. Remember that early in 1941, the American people, through their representatives, adopted overwhelmingly the Lease Land Bill. This was a bill to put us into an undeclared war against Germany. There were a good many politicians in the country at the time who didn't want to admit that fact. But the American people luckily knew what they were doing and knew that they were moving into an undeclared war against Germany. And from that time on, we were spending our money to defeat the Axis in Europe, using our shipyards to repair their war vessels, the war vessels of the enemies of the Axis in Europe, and in general doing all that we could do short of shooting. And from that time on, the only argument was how thoroughly America would fight back against her enemies. There was no question about our having chosen sides. We'd chosen sides all right, and there was no question that we knew that we were being attacked. So we are not at war just because somebody dropped a lot of bombs on us at Pearl Harbor. The Axis was doing its best to drag us down long before Pearl Harbor, and we were doing a lot of harm to the Axis long before Pearl Harbor. After conscientious debate, after a really genuine democratic debate,
The American people had decided that they were in danger and that they must take sides to save themselves. And why had we come to that decision early in 41, a great many months before Pearl Harbor? I suggest that the answer is this. The American people had taught themselves painfully and against the grain that this war was not an old-fashioned war for land or money, not a war of imperialism, not a war of limited objectives, not a little war inside a civilization in which it is possible to be neutral, because no matter who wins, the civilization can go on. We had taught ourselves, and I think we have a right to feel that we did a good job in teaching ourselves, that this was a war of unlimited objectives, a war of neck or nothing, a war against civilization itself, a war in which nobody can be a neutral because the fate of all people everywhere is being decided. We taught ourselves that what is taking place is a worldwide civil war, and people who want to be neutral in a worldwide civil war aren't any too bright, because all they're doing is handing over their fate to somebody else to decide whether or not they are to have a chance to have a future. The war, I suggest, gentlemen, is the military phase of this worldwide revolt against civilization. And unless we understand why the revolt is taking place and deal with the causes of that revolt, the revolt will continue after the war, and we will find that the next peace, like the last one, is just another armistice, and that isn't good enough. What do I mean by civilization when I say we've got a worldwide revolt against civilization? What is it that our enemies are revolting against? Civilization, I suggest to you, means a set of rules that people for the most part obey, rules that you and I make and live up to. It means promises that you and I make to one another as members of a community, and that for the most part we keep. It means institutions and self-discipline that you and I impose upon each other. These disciplines and these rules and these customs have grown up. We create them out of our national history in order to bring out what is best in man and to suppress what is worst in man. And above all, civilization means some kind of an affirmation about the meaning of life, why we are on this strange and tragic globe that we all inhabit. The meaning of life, an affirmation about it, which most of us accept. If the civilization is to be any good, that affirmation has to be good. And in the case of our Western civilization, it is good. The affirmation is that all men are created equal in the eyes of God, that all men have something of the divine spark in them, and that this thing which we have in common, all of us, is far more important than anything which separates man from his neighbor. This is the affirmation on which our world rests. To whatever extent we betray the affirmation, to that same extent we weaken our faith in our civilization and make it possible for ambitious men to lead a revolt against our civilization. And never forget that 8 great civilizations have died before ours ever came into being. And on each occasion, the civilization had first begun to lose faith in itself. I suggest that this worldwide revolt against our civilization could not have got underway unless we in the modern world had begun to lose faith in ourselves. Millions of men and women all over the world would not have lent themselves to the purposes of the barbarians who were trying to kill our world unless they had begun to get despairing and cynical about the life which they were leading. Before you can have a Hitler who can get millions of followers or a Mussolini, you've got to have people who are willing to listen to that kind of tripe. And you get those people by having a world in which there is a loss of faith in the meaning of civilization itself and the kind of a life that we're leading. What were the roots of this despair and this cynicism? If we can answer that question, we can see to it that after we have beaten our enemies this time, the revolt won't begin all over again. Let me give a few illustrations of the way in which we here in our country have helped to breed this cynicism which has done so much to ruin our world. I choose illustrations from our life in America, first because I think that we ought to be more interested in our sins than in the sins of our neighbors, and second because I know that our sins are more important than the sins of anybody else, because we are more important, not because we're better, but because Providence gave us the natural resources. Providence gave us the great tradition, which made our country the hope of the human race and the most important country. And the same Providence that gave us that good luck gave us the immense burden of having to carry the hopes of mankind, of having to live better than other people. Because if we don't, the whole human race becomes cynical and hopeless. And when that happens, civilization declines. First, as a sign of our sins, let's remember that by the time the people who were in the armed forces of our country in the last war got back home from the war, they found that the country back home had decided to say, we do not care about the pledged word of the United States. We don't care about the fact that twice in the last 18 months we have said we would collaborate with the human race in trying to create a world in which you can change the status quo by the life of reason, by intelligence, instead of by the application of pure force. We don't care about that. We want to get back to the delicious pastime of selling each other goods and services. And so far as the honor of our country is concerned, or the pledged word of our country, we are not especially interested. And remember that Woodrow Wilson in 1919 told us, the American people, if you commit this sin, you will break the heart of the human race. And the American people didn't believe him. The American people thought those were just the words of an ex-college professor who didn't know about the facts of life. Well, we don't have to argue that one today. We know that the ex-college professor was right and that the American people were wrong. That it is true that the human race has a heart which can be broken. That people have hopes which, if they are too long deferred, do fester and do turn into cynicism. We know that now. It's a pity we didn't know it in 1919 and 1920. Let me give you another illustration of the way in which this thing has happened. In 1920, at the Republican National Convention, Senator Penrose was asked, what is a good thing with which to fight? What is a good word with which to fight this coming campaign? And he said the word Americanism, I think, is a good one. And somebody asked him, what does Americanism mean? And Senator Penrose of Pennsylvania said, I'm damned if I know what it means, but I know it means a lot of votes. Here was a man who had been sent back 5 times to the Senate of the United States. Here is a man who was carrying one of the greatest traditions that any people have ever inherited. And he was cynical and he was stupid, and he thought it was smart to say he was damned if he knew what Americanism meant, what the greatest of human traditions meant, and that all he knew it meant was a lot of votes. That is not the way to keep people together, believing in the promises they make to one another, believing in their rules, believing in their institutions. Out of that kind of action on our part, I could give you plenty of other illustrations, as you know. And I could give you endless illustrations on the part of other nations than our nations who were being as bad as we were or much worse. But I've explained why I hold my illustrations to our sins. Out of that kind of action on our part and on the part of other peoples, there came this growth of cynicism and nihilism, which made it possible for the barbarian to come back to earth. The barbarian is the man who believes in power for power's sake, and nothing but power for power's sake. Not rules, not promises, not discipline, but just power for power's sake, which means government by terror and by the secret police. I suggest to you that this war had to happen because there are too many barbarians like that loose in the world. Too many people who don't believe in an ordered life. And if we see this war in these large terms, we see it in its full dignity and terror and importance. We see that we have 2 big jobs on our hands: to beat the enemy on the field of battle and to suppress in our own hearts the cynicism, the tendency to underplay our great tradition, which has made possible the rise of so formidable a foe. This is a war of ideas. This is the kind of fight we might lose unless we worry about ideas. Not power, but decency. Not money, but real Americanism. The kind Penrose didn't know about, that you and I do.
From Mitchell Field on Long Island, the War Department and CBS broadcast the fifth in a series of talks to American soldiers everywhere called What Are We Fighting For? This evening's speaker was Herbert Agar, president of Freedom House, editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, and conductor of the column also titled What Are We Fighting For? In the Courier-Journal, the newspaper PM, and other papers. Next week at the same time, CBS will have its lines in one of our Army camps in the South, Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, so that you may hear the talk of that famous sergeant of the First World War, Alvin C. York. John Tillman speaking. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The best soldiers in the world are the ones who know what they're fighting for. And to make our soldiers the best informed in the world, the War Department has been presenting discussions before our troops at Army posts all over the country. Each Thursday at this time, for some weeks past, the Columbia Network has broadcast one of these talks from some Army post. In the past weeks, you have heard Edward R. Murrow, William L. Shirer, Lee White, Quentin Reynolds, and Herbert Agar. Tonight we bring you the concluding program of this series, What Are We Fighting For?, from Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Here, 15,000 officers and men are assembled to hear a distinguished soldier of the First World War. To introduce him, we present the commander of the 82nd Division, Major General O.N. Bradley. General Bradley.
On October 8, 1918, Sergeant Alvin C. York, a member of the 82nd American Division, captured almost single-handed 132 German officers and men. For this feat, he was designated as the outstanding soldier of the AEF. The 82nd Division, known then and now as the All-American Division, has been reactivated and is now assembled on a hillside here at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Every present member of the division hopes to emulate the example set by Sergeant York. Today, the War Department announced the appointment of Sergeant York as a major in the Army of the United States. Men of the 82nd Division, here is your Sergeant York.
Thank you, General Bradley. I'm mighty proud to be here with my old division, the 82nd, even if it's only for a visit. The old 82nd was mustered out after the last war, but in the hearts of the men who served with it over there, the All-American Division never was and never could be mustered out. I'll never forget my first day with the old outfit at Camp Gordon, Georgia. It was in November 1917. They put me in the 21st Training Battalion, and it seemed like they had a job for me right off. They told me they were going to put me on the police. I thought that's not so bad for an old mountain boy, getting on the police the first crack out of the box. So the rest of the day I went around camp doing police work. Yes, sir, policing. Policing for scraps of paper and cigarette butts. Seriously, though, being here with the 82nd again is a peculiar feeling. It's like living something all over. Here you boys are training to finish the job we thought we had done for all time. The job of keeping our country's freedom from going under the heels of the dictator. Last time after the Germans hung out the white rag and we sailed home, we thought there'd never be another war. We doughboys didn't realize then, and some of the men in the higher places didn't realize, that freedom is not a thing you can win once and for all. We never owned freedom. We only got a lease on it. A payment came due in 17 and 18. Now another one is due.
But this time we're going to make such a big payment that it'll be a many of a year before another one is demanded of us. The Germans have always underestimated us Americans. I remember one day back in the Argonne, when we took several prisoners, I noticed one German corporal looking us over, mightily puzzled. He could speak a little English. He asked if all of us in the outfit were Americans. We told him we were. He just shook his head. Didn't seem that he could take it at all. You see, the All-American Division was made up of boys from all over the country. There were boys from the mountains like me and boys from the small towns and cities. There were Southerners, New Yorkers, Middle Westerners, as well as boys from the cow country and the Pacific coast. And there were men whose folks had been Greek, Italian, Jewish, German, Polish, Swedish, and Irish. Just every strain of good American you could think of. It sure seemed to get this German corporal down. He just couldn't understand how we could all pull together and smash up soldiers of the great German race. Today, the Germans and the Japs, that goes for the Japs too, they can't get it through their thick heads that it's not your creed or your height, nor the color of your eyes that makes an American. It's our freedom and equality over the Constitution and our Bill of Rights that makes an American an almighty fighter. Once a man has tasted that freedom, he'd rather die fighting than to do without it for himself and his children. I've never doubted for 1 minute who's going to win this war. Already, we're over the hump. Like General Marshall said the other day, the time for action is near. The Germans say, oh, you fellas can't fight a modern war. You've got too much of that freedom and democracy stuff to win a modern war. Boys, I don't have to tell you what a big lie that is. It's because of his freedom and democracy that the American soldier has never and will never lose any war. The American soldier doesn't need any of the false morale that comes from a diet of pumping lies. He knows what he is fighting for, and he knows and can stand to know that the enemy is tough and well-trained and well-equipped. You don't have to tell him that the other fellow is a coward to make him fight. What's more, he can take it as well as dish it out. The American fighting man is like... The American fighting man is like high-grade spring steel. He can whipsaw around and bend if need be, but then he bounces back like the kick of an army mule. Now, your Jap, German, and Italian soldiers just hasn't got that advantage. He has been crammed fuller of lies than a possum with the Simmons at frost time. That's one of the big reasons why Hitler, the puny empire, and that flop Mussolini are bound to lose. Let me give you a sample from the last war. The Kaiser's propaganda sharpers told the Germans they needn't worry. They said the United States wouldn't ever be able to throw any real weight into that fight. They've got to keep their little old army at home to fight off the Indians. And the Germans had been swallowed up by lies so long that they swallowed that foolishness whole. So what happened? The Americans kept coming over, thousands on top of thousands, in spite of the Indians. And the shock was just too big for most of those Germans to take. They saw that their government had been feeding them plain, bare-faced flappadoos. their heart went out of the most of the Germans. That's when the old Kaiser's throne broke down, and he caught himself some air for Holland. But now the Germans and the Japs have gone and made the same mistake. They built their kind of government on bloody lies. They've taught their troops that their enemies would run like turkeys whenever they showed up. They've sworn themselves blue in the face that nobody would ever be strong enough to bomb their homeland. Well, the Russians and the boys of Bataan and Corregidor have kind of taken one set of those lies down a few pegs. The RAF's air offensive over Germany and somebody's planes over Tokyo, of course, we don't know whose planes, just in case the Jap is listening, anyhow. It looks like they made a little mistake on that lie, too. When our Navy and you boys really get a whack at those Japs and Germans, and when those fellows really learn what it means to pick a scrap with the American eagle, well, boys, it's going to be too bad. When it's time to fight, America doesn't piddle around. They finish it up so they can get back to that pretty girl who's waiting for them at home. Back in 1918, when we first got to France, we were broke up in replacements for the French Army. A bunch of us boys from the 82nd Division were sent to the Voice Mountains to help a French outfit. When we got there, the French officer in charge gave us a little lecture. None of us could parlez-vous, so we just said okay to everything he said. Next morning, the Germans came over. We let go with our Springfields and automatics, and I tell you, we really dusted their britches. And they turned out for home. Meanwhile, there wasn't a Frenchman in sight. They'd all retreated. Pretty soon the French officer came back. He was stomping mad. We couldn't understand what he said this time any more than we had before. About that time, an American liaison officer happened along. He told us what the French officer was so stirred up about. And it seems that in this sector, the French officer had an understanding with the Germans that one day he'd let the Germans take his front line trenches, and the next day the Germans would let his outfit take them back. That didn't suit our book at all. The American officer told that French fella that we'd come here to fight. Said if he didn't want us disturbing the peace in his part of the war, he'd better get rid of us. That's exactly what happened. That Frenchman had us transferred back to the All-American Division, back to the American forces. After that, General Pershing got all the Americans together and broke the Hindenburg Line. People say to me, Sergeant, how do you think these boys of 42 compare with those fellows who fought the last war? Now, I want to say to you boys of the 82nd Division that I tell the people who ask me that, I won't say you're a better natural-born scrappers than your fathers were. Americans have always been good fighters when they need be. But you boys are better trained and equipped. You are smarter and no more than any American army of our history. I am confident, the American people are confident, that you will do a better job than we did last time. Today, the threat to our American freedom is greater than this country has ever known. And I'll guarantee that the licking Uncle Sam's boys will give those fellows is going to be bigger than the threat.
Sergeant Alvin C. York, famous soldier of the First World War, has been heard speaking to officers and men of his old division, the 82nd at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in the sixth and last of a series of broadcasts designed to keep our soldiers the best informed in the world. This series has been presented by the War Department and the Columbia Network to troops both at home and overseas, and was heard through the facilities of WWL in New Orleans. Mike Clark speaking. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.